So, Thomas Lindbom, thank you very much for joining us. So I'll just give a little introduction for the viewers, is that you are the son of Tage Lindbom, who is, I would argue, the single perennialist writer who has written the most directly about politics, and that's what makes him of particular interest to this channel, to this project. And I've made a number of videos about him before, and there will be more to come. So, as a kind of general background pictures is what I wanted to do with this interview. And I mean, I think you're probably the foremost expert on him speaking English. So that's why we're interviewing you today. So thank you very much for assenting to the interview. Um, so I thought it would just make an interesting introduction to people if you could explain the story of how you discovered your father's religion. I think this is a very interesting anecdote.
Yes, it was a little bit shocking too when it happened. I was 13 years old, and it was a late afternoon in Stockholm where we lived in a very nice area of Stockholm, the center of Stockholm. And I had been to school, I've seen a friend, and I was coming home around maybe 5, 6 in the afternoon or something. And I thought that my dad would be at home. He had work as a chief librarian at the movement of the socialist movement in Sweden, and because he was a social democrat at that time, at least officially he was. And I came home and I first looked if he was in his working room, because he had a special room for writing books and reading and so on. He wasn't there, so I think maybe he was in the sleeping room. So I very easily knocked at the door, which was closed, and opened it. And then it was like a shock, because it was not what I had expected. I had expected him uh, lying on the bed reading or something, which he very often did. But it was almost dark in the room, and I could see someone. I saw it was my father on the carpet on the floor, and he had something very, very strange, a long dress or something. He had also sort of a round cap on his skull, and uh, and he had a book beside him, and I could see that there would be a carpet I've never seen before. It was not the European style, it was something oriental. And it was like ice coming over me, a shock. And he didn't say anything. He was lying, he didn't move. I was standing, I didn't move. We didn't say anything to each other. I don't know for how long it lasted, maybe for 10 seconds or 15 seconds. And then I almost rushed out of the room, and I looked for my mother, and I found her. She was a psychotherapist, and he had her clients at home. So she waited for a new client if it was 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock in the evening. And I said, "But Dad, has he become a Catholic?" Because Catholic, that was so strange for me. Sweden was a very, very homogeneous country at the time. Everybody was Lutheran, or everyone, most of them were not believing in God at all, but it was like that. And so I said, "Catholic." "No," she answered, and then she had a very, very also icy voice when she answered, "No, your father has become a Mohammedan." And she said that like that. It was not warm, it was not happy, it was nothing at all. So we stood also there like two ice blocks looking at each other, and then the run from the door, and the next client was coming. So I sat there with this shocking experience. So that was the afternoon. It was not a very good first meeting.
No, thank you very much and for that. Well, I think you described it very lyrically and immersively. So thank you. Um, yeah, and I mean, the listeners might not, or the viewers might not appreciate this, but this was in 1965, is that right?
It's two, I think.
62.
Uh,
The first mosque in Sweden wasn't opened until 1979. So I just that gives a sort of sense to people how strange and sort of foreign that was. I also, yeah, I'll keep him anonymous, but I know someone in Shuon's order who lost his wife because of his conversion to Islam. Um, so yeah, I mean, that
Yeah, and I mean, my mother was very close to leave my father too. That was she. You have to understand. Now we come into this situation, but don't forget that they were both very active social democrats. They were active atheists. They met in 1939, and they were both, especially my father, by writing books, by being one of very important persons in the social democratic movement. And my mother was also very close to everything, even if she was a member of the party, but she wasn't active in the party in that way. But it was so far away for her also. And for the where I grew up the first 10, 12 years, it was as a secular family. It was not something Christian, warm Christian or something, and someone came from that to Islam. No, it was absolutely athe going in one afternoon for me from that feeling over to this new situation.
yeah, I mean it's very, very stark. And I think in a lot of the discourse today about sort of the encounter, the conflict with Islam in Europe, it's often framed in terms of Christianity and Islam, but it's really not it. It's something much more unbridgeable than that. So, as you're saying, atheism in Islam. Um, because I mean, really, Christianity and Islam are not a million miles apart. But let's kind of segue into which you touched on. I think that's more interesting for the viewers. Your father's history in the socialist movement, because he was a very important figure in the Swedish socialist movement. So maybe you could sort of give us the background he had there.
Yeah, he was he was adopted, very young child, and that's a long story, but we can't go into that now. But he felt, in a way, not physically abandoned, but mentally abandoned, and he felt that he was like not accepted in the traditional family-oriented society of a sort of conservative way in Sweden that last for even for his first decades of his life. I mean, he was born in 1909. So, but he felt that, and he became socialist maybe because of that feeling of being, in a way, mentally abandoned by his real parents, and then but also by his adopted parents. But he was a very intelligent boy, and he came to university, which was not evident for someone coming from a little town in northern Sweden at the time of 1928, when he passed his exam at the high school. So, but he studied at the university in Uppsala, and then in Stockholm, and he took a degree in political science, a doctor degree. And but then he was and he had a very interesting journey, political journey. He became atheist, as I said, but also he was communist for a period because he felt that he was so. He said to me and to others, that he felt like he was ice in his heart. I talk about this ice. I've already talked about that, but it was something that he talked about, and he went to therapy. One of the first therapists in Sweden, he went there already in the 30s, beginning of the 1930s, and there was, I mean, the real Freudian, first Freudian period. But he felt that social democrat wasn't radical enough, so he became a Moscow communist for a couple of years. But then he said to me that I with the therapy, my heart was warmed up sufficiently to be able to abandon this communism and to go back to the social democracy. and he did that in, I think it was 35 or 36 or something. And then he made a career in the Social Democratic Party. He was 38 or 39. He became then director of this library, which was covering all the socialist and working class movement of Sweden, and he made it a very important library, an archive also. And he got a lot of important roles in the Swedish Social Democratic Party during especially during the 40s. And he was especially oriented very cultural politics, and he pushed the party to be more radical in cultural questions, because they were before much more bourgeois. They didn't have a cultural politics. They were interested more in the Social Democratic Party about the social and economic issues. But he said we must talk about psychology, radical psychology. We must talk about cultural issues. So in a way, he was more radical than the Social Democratic Party in that way. So that was and when I was born in 1949, you could say he was on the top of being an important person in the Social Democratic Party and also in the cultural life of Sweden. He was all the time in radio talking about different issues. He knew, I mean, he knew really so many people in the broader way, the culture, intellectual life of Sweden. You may say it's not a very uh, important to be intellectual in Sweden, but he was really one. He knew, I would say, he knew everyone. He knew all the politicians, all the ministers, the government. He knew the big writers of novels. He knew the composers, and so on and so on. And some of them I met when I was a child, because he still had these contacts. But it was something, maybe you will ask question about that, but it's something happened when we go from the 1940s over to the 1950s.
So uh, I want to touch on that, but just but before we get there, a few other things. So um, sort of delving into his background in socialism, because I think there's a lot of sort of interesting questions there. There's one thing is that you have a painting in the background there, which I believe has sort of an interesting story tied into his background in the socialist movement. Could you tell us a little about that?
Yeah, yeah. This is the gift of the Social Democratic Party to him when he got 50 years old. That was in October 1959. And I remember we were going to Malmö, the third town of Sweden, the south of Sweden, that day, because he didn't want to be have so many people coming home and greeting him on his 50th birthday. He was still already, he has left mentally the socialism, but he was not officially a non-socialist. So it was a very complicated period. But the party has sent him this gift, and this is the first copy, 150 lithography, I think you say in English, of this. And this is something around 30 or 40. And the first was given to the Prime Minister in 1951, and he got the 37th or something in 1959. So it was a very, very beautiful gift from the Social Democratic Party to thank him. And the painter of this painting is Sven Exet Eriksson, and he is one of the maybe two, three, four most important painters of the 20th century in Sweden. And he was also part of the growing radical cultural world of Sweden, who started the same time as my father get adult and was in the socialist and radical and cultural radical movement in Stockholm from 1930, 35, and so on. So this is it's very important, because it gives it shows how my father, because he knew, of course, personally this painter also, and they were friends. So this is a part of a new Swedish radicalism who took over Sweden and still is, if you talk about culture, in a very broad sense, it's still Sweden.
Mm, mm, mm. Um, I have a question about that, but I'd like to come back to that in a minute. There's a couple of incidences I wanted to ask about because I think they're quite interesting. Your father, he had, to my understanding, an excellent command of the German language, and quite an involvement with Germany. He'd been to Germany several times. He wrote an excellent book about Germany, the Fallet Tyskland. Um, and I know he had sort of friendships or relationships. I'm not sure how well best to characterize it with some of the German socialists who were sort of seeking refuge in Sweden during the Third Reich. And I was wondering if you could tell us about a couple of those. A couple particularly interesting would be Willy Brandt and Bruno Kreis, who was I forget exactly his position in the. I think he was the.
I can tell. I can
Yeah, you
tell.
can tell. You can tell. Go on, please.
Because Willy Brandt was he became chancellor of the West German BRD country before the when they moved when they became one single Germany. But he was in Norway most of the time during the war. He was a refugee, of course, because he had already played a role in socialism when Hitler took the power. So he came to Germany, but he was to Norway, but he was also in Stockholm. But I know that my father, he knew him. They knew each other. He came to the archive, the library, from time to time. But my father told me that he only had one single real long discussion with Willy Brandt, and he was not fond of him. He thought that he was in a way, it was, if I say superficial, it sounds maybe a little too much, but he didn't have the profound reflections of politics as my father asked to have from person like him. And he has been so much respected in the Western radical and political radical world. So that's interesting that he said so. But there was another one, and you mentioned Bruno Kreisky, who was from Austria, and he became also chancellor of Austria after the war. And he was living in Stockholm. He talked fluent Swedish whole life. And I only know that my father respected him and liked him very much. He was a warm and good person. So for him, it was a difference between Willy Brandt and Kreisky. I have probably never met them. They left when I wasn't born. I mean, they went back to their countries in 45, 46. But I've heard from them. But my father didn't talk very much of them. But when he talked, it was like that.
Mm, mm.
Warm about Kreisky, cold about Willy Brandt.
Well, thank you. So a last question about your father's socialist period, before we'll move on, is there's a maybe an amusing, or I'm not sure how to characterize it, but an anecdote about how he was detained or held in suspicion on when he visited America in the 1950s, maybe in connection with
49, yeah.
nine. Maybe you could tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, he was already at the airport. I guess it was the CIA who took him and put him in jail in Ellis Island in the prison there, and so he was sitting there for 3 days, and it was during the McCarthy period when the American authorities were very keen on chasing communists, and they were suspicious about people from Europe who were more to the left, and they thought they had knowledge about some people that my father would meet in during 1 month or something. He was going to stay in the States, and that was already suspicious for them. So he took them for 3 days. And he was sitting there and together with a Dane who was very good at drawing. So I remember when I grew up, I was drawing on the in the hall of our apartment with the drawings about my father sitting there in the in the prison of Ellis Island, and so. But it was very much written about it in Swedish papers, and it was a quite a big story about that, and very odd situation, of course, but it didn't play a more important role. I mean, then he could travel around in the States during this month and meet all these socialists he wanted to meet, and that was no problem.
All right, well, thank you. So moving on, could you describe how your father came to his break with, because these are connected things, his break with socialism, and also how he discovered and came to embrace perennialism and Islam specifically.
Yeah,
It's a
it's
big.
a long period. It's a long period. I think it's a period of around 7, 8 years or something. And first of all, it's very complicated to analyze why Tage, my father, left the socialism. I think there was one idealistic explanation that he found that after the Second World War, it was not more possible for the leading social democrats, the government or the party officials and so on, to continue to talk about socialism as something which would give the workers another dignity in the society. The idea of socialism was something that you cultivate people. They would not only be working, they would also be interested in culture and be better persons in a way, mentally and culturally. And he saw that that wasn't possible, and also the leading persons in the Social Democratic Party had also talked to him about that during these years 50, 51, or maybe earlier, that we go out and meet the workers around in the country, and we try to talk about how we could refine, make finer the life of a socialist life. And they met someone who said, when will you give us more better pensions? Or you, I mean, everything was more and more around the materialistic issues. And my father, he felt that this wasn't good, and he was that bothered him, and that struck him also that it was like that. And he started to think that socialism isn't a way out of what he had thought of could be being a better person, better society, and more dignified, if you say so, society, and so on. That's one thing. Another explanation can be that he felt that with his capacities, he was a very, not only had his PhD and so on, but he also read a lot of books. He read philosophy. He was thinking around profound questions of life, even if it was not around religion, but it was he was still an atheist. But I mean, he thought about philosophy and how you could have a good life and so on. And he met no one in the socialist movement who were interested in that, who understood that. So I think there are some of them. There are some explanations. There are others too, but let's take these two explanations. And he started to criticize. I think a third, yes, and that links to the others. That in order to continue for the party to have the power, they must be more and more technocratic. They be more and more authoritarian. The socialist movement from the beginning was an idea of that people from the base would influence the politics. Democracy is that. The idea of democracy is that. But they found, Tage, my father, found more and more that it was people coming into the party who were like a conductor of an orchestra, the man in the top would decide what the people downstairs in the in the bass would think, or what we should give them so they are happy. So it's another way of seeing of politics. It's less democratic in that sense. So that is also important for him. So the book he wrote in 1951 after Atlantis was the first book where he started to criticize the socialism and the idea of the socialist democracy. And that was a book from inside, but it was also respected by some of the socialists. They felt the same, especially people in the cultural sphere. But for the government, for the prime minister and these people, that was something they didn't like. They understood later on that it was something important that Tage has said, but at the time it was difficult for him. So what happened? He felt that he was. I think it's very much. It was also himself. He was when he felt that he was not accepted, then he left. So he decided to go away from all he had done in the party. He left all his positions. He still stayed at the library and so on. But most of the things he left. He didn't talk anymore in radio. So it was very much what happened. And then he started to study philosophy. And that was during 10 years. But it happened something around 56, 57, when he thought that a society cannot, without a God, cannot survive. So, and he had a feeling when he went to the Cathedral of Chartres in, I think it was in 757, I'm not exactly sure. And there he had, he met God, he says so. He met God in Chartres. And when he wrote this book, which is, maybe you are interested in some of the books later on in this interview, which are important, he wrote a book which was presented, edited in 1962, but were written already in 70s, 57, 58. It was also, you can see that he's a religious man. He believes in God. And this was written after this meeting with God in Chartres in France, but before having met the Sufism.
Mm.
So it's between. So there is nothing of perennialism in the book 1962, but you have to know the history because you could think so. Because when I was meeting my father in 62, he was a Sufi, but and the book came out the same year, but it was written 3 or 4 years earlier. You understand me?
Yes, so thank you. So continuing with that, so I understand well, it actually would be an interesting story for you to recount his encounter with, I believe it went first perennialism and then Sufism, is that right? Um yes, that was through Kurt Almqvist.
Yes, Kurt
Maybe.
Almqvist is a
Yeah.
very important person. Maybe the viewers of this video don't know him, but he was a Swede also, and he had written a book um, in Swedish, and my father got it from one editor who refused to take his manuscript. But he said maybe it was too radical for him. It was a big editing house. They didn't want to risk anything with giving presenting Tage Lindbom at that time. It had been easier when he was a social democrat 10 years earlier, but now it was more complicated. So he said, but this book from Kurt Almqvist, have you known about him? And my father, he didn't know at all who was Kurt Almqvist. But he went home and took the book, he went home, he read it, and he was fascinated and took contact with him. And they met, and my father told me that one day, I think they had several meetings, but my father started to think, what is he talking about here? And he said, Kurt, is this Islam? And then it was like all the curtains down, all the windows closed. I mean, again, Sweden in 19, what is that, 58 or 59 or something. That was even more than when I was a child in 62. I mean, so that everything was closed, and he said he didn't even said yes. He just nodded like that. It is Islam. And then they continued to discuss, and Kurt Almqvist introduced him to the Tariqa and so on. But that's a later story. Mm.
Well, maybe I mean, I don't know if you feel at liberty to tell us about that part of the story, but
Yeah, no, it's no problem because but I don't know very much of it. I
hmm.
mean, what happened in the family? You understand, I was 9 years old. We went to soccer games together and these things, and we didn't talk about religion and what I never knew anything of what my father has gone through during these years. And the funny thing is that I mean, it's I could never have an idea. I may have come home and said that we prayed at school or something, but he never said anything about it. So for me, it was like it has always been in my family. I would put the word secular on it because I didn't use that word when I was 8 years old. But it was that what it was. But then so that what happened was that afternoon when I came into the room and saw him on the carpet, that was the beginning. And then step by step, I understood some things about what he was doing and that he was going to Lausanne to the group with Fritjof Schuon as a leader and with other people. I knew that Kurt Almqvist and his brother, who was ambassador of Sweden in Tokyo in Japan, were also members of this Tariqa. I got more and more information, but it was still very little. And I must say that for me, it came from outside. You are not, if you are brought up in, for example, it could be a Muslim or a Christian family, and you start when you are very little and you pray with your parents and your sisters and brothers and everything, you feel this is part of life.
Hmm.
But for me, it came from outside. Someone said, I'm a Muslim and I believe in this. Good for you. That was the best I could say, but I don't want to be integrated in it. So that was my absolute feeling during all these years.
So I'm not sure if you want to talk about this, and we don't have to, but if you don't want to, but did your father make any effort to introduce you to Islam? I mean, I know it didn't take, but was there ever an attempt in that direction?
Yeah, it was a little attempt, not very far after this afternoon. He
Mm.
opened the door when he had his prayers, and so that was also to my mother because he had in the beginning, I think, a little hope that she would be interested in converting to Islam. But we both were so disturbed by that. So we just said, close the door. We don't want to see.
Mm.
So do that, but we don't want to see. And I can still feel the the problem I had mentally with this during not only the years when I was a teenager, but later on too. I think that I have been through a very complicated life in my relation to my father because of that. And I think it is especially that it was coming from outside. It was not integrated in. I couldn't understand why we should be Muslim now. We haven't been that when for the first 13 years of my life, so important life of a young
Mm.
boy.
So, sort of on a similar note, I know there were many many people amongst the Swedish conservatives who there was a lot of receptivity to at least elements of your father's thought, and so maybe you could talk a little about that, but also I get the sense that maybe one reason there wasn't greater receptivity, or I would let me put it this way. I'd like to ask, do you think his religion was an impediment to or got in the way of Swedish conservatives being open to his ideas?
Yeah, the first thing is that he didn't tell.
Hmm.
He understood. I think he discussed that with the other persons in the Troika, that it's not possible to go out and say, especially for someone who was he was less official in the Swedish society, but still he wrote books. He talked sometimes in the radio, or he interviewed in papers, and so, and people knew, a lot of people knew who he was. So telling people in 1960s, for example, that he was a Muslim, that would have been so complicated, he assumed, to put through some of his ideas. So it was better to talk about his ideas and not mentioning that it was in a way related to Sufism, or Muslim, or what you would call it. So that is very important. So when we had the the funeral in 2001, which was also interesting in the Swedish Lutheran Church,
Hmm.
and he did that. I'm not really sure why he did, but I think he wanted to be a part of the Swedish society, and he didn't see the Lutheran Church as a place of religion more than a officials official Swedish way of having people buried, in a way. So when they came there, a lot of people, conservative and conservative priests, also Catholic priests who liked him very much. They had all liked his books, and they have read them, and they have discussed them, and he had them for dinner, and at home, and I met them also as an adult. And they were all there, and no one knew that what was a there was still a secret. He had said to me some years before he died, "You now can tell people if you feel it necessary that I am a Muslim." But during the years from 62 up till at least beginning of the 90s, I was not obliged to tell.
Mm, mm, mm.
So I didn't tell my wife, who was French. I didn't tell my children. So they had to know, they knew that when they were in the teenage period. And they said, yeah, my grandfather, he was so special. So if he was a Muslim, it's nothing special. It's like all the other things. And they took it very, very easily, and in a very good way. But you understand that it was not that people said, oh, he's a Muslim, we don't like his ideas, because people didn't know. And I remember very, very strongly one evening, late evening, 2 or 3 years after my father's death, a very well-known priest of the Swedish Lutheran Church called me. He was there for the funeral. He had been there for a lot of times. He knew my father very well. And he phoned me and said, I have understood that your father was a Muslim. And I said, yes, that's right. And he needed to have a talk with me. I was consoling him to this old. He was not older than me, but I mean, he was a priest. He has been sitting on the bed of so many people during their life and saying good words to them. Now I had to to say good words to him, because he was, I wouldn't say shocked, but he was embarrassed, and about, I have known Tage Lindbom for so many years, and I've never thought that he was a Muslim. I have had my doubts about if he was really a good Christian or a good Lutheran and so, but not being a Muslim. And that was something which was difficult for of course, for a traditional Lutheran priest. I mean, it's not, they're not anti-Muslim, but they are anti. They want to have their religion, and Islam is another religion, and there are differences. So yeah, so that's one. So my answer is that my father didn't tell, and when people then got to know it, it was in a way a little complicated for some people, but not so much as you could imagine. I think that most of them have said that he had good ideas, he was a good person, and we don't care very much of if he was Christian or Muslim or anything else.
Well, thank you. So the next question I have is it's a big one. So I apologize and for it'll be difficult to answer, but could you summarize for us Taga's mature political philosophy? Since I mean, what he wrote about primarily was politics. I mean, it's primarily for the viewer, so assuming that they know basically nothing.
Mm, mm. He was, I think, in the Tarika. I hope I used the good word in English now, but in Lausanne and later on in Bloomington in the United States, he was the one who was the most political. I think most of them were spiritual persons. They were interested maybe in philosophy, but it was religious philosophy and so on. They were their subjects. And for my father, he had a long period of, I mean, he was a PhD, had a PhD in political science. And so he was thinking politically very much. And when he broke, you have to say that, broke with socialism and all that, he broke with modernism. And he broke with a lot of ideas of what are key words in the modern societies. One key word is, for example, democracy. And to say that someone is not democratic, it means that you are for autocratic dictator like Stalin or Hitler or some you like him. I mean, that would be the second question if you say I'm not for democracy. For my father, it was not that. It was a question of putting the man instead of God in the center of the world. And what people in the 21st century in the Western countries do, that is go around that question. I mean, if you say that, you say at the same time, I believe in God, and then I say I believe in the absolute power of the people for creating a society. And if someone would say, isn't there a problem with that? They would never answer that question, or no one will ask that question either. So I mean, it's a part of. But my father, he took up these questions. He said that democracy is not a question of being a good person ethically or being for freedom for mankind or sort of that. It's a question of putting man instead of God in the center of life. So I think that is something that you must understand when he was in a way criticizing. And very often you can be put, if you take today, national right people, very often from journalists in Sweden, at least I guess in other countries too, they will put the question to a national right person, do you prefer Putin to Starmer, or do you prefer Kamala Harris to Orban? And that sort of question. And then if you say I prefer Orban to Kamala Harris, then you are a bad person, and so on. That lies in the question. And my father was always meeting people who said that, for example, we can have problems in Sweden, but we must be happy that we can express our thoughts. We can go to the church we want to go to, but look at Russia, Soviet Union. They are put in jail if they do something which is wrong. And my father, he was always smiling and going home. And then around the dinner table, he said that I met someone who said like that. And then he said, he talked about the problems with the Western civilization and the decline of the Western civilization. He never thought that Stalin would be better than Winston Churchill or someone like that. But it was, he was interested in what is happening with the decline, what he saw it, the decline of the Western society coming already from the Middle Age, going to up to our time. So he was, in that political sense, he was difficult because he he was interested in sessions in the, yes, in the decline of of Western societies, and not so interested in criticizing what was for him godless too. I mean, Stalin was godless, Hitler was god. He didn't like, of course, he didn't like that. Absolutely not. But his fight was to show that there is something rotten with with the modern European states.
And it's interesting that you end on that note because I haven't read all of your father's works, but all of the ones that I have read have this common theme or structure where it sort of traces the decline. Specifically of Western thought. I feel like everything I've read of his looks at some particular aspect of Western political thought and then traces the decline.
Hmm.
I mean, do you think that's a fair characterization of his
Yeah,
work?
I think you are quite right, and that's his idea of the decline of the societies and the Western society where he lives is obvious, and he also talks to people in the Western societies. He doesn't talk to Russians. He doesn't talk to people in China or even in the Arabic countries or something. So if you read him, you have to, I think, read it with that understanding that he's talking to Western people. He is a Western people, even if he converted to Islam, which is not very Westerny from the beginning, at least. So that's true. You are right.
And that's also a very interesting point is that yes, he doesn't talk about he has this singular focus on Western political thought. I mean, he does even sort of the Russian and Orthodox world he barely addresses. So it's yeah, sorry, it's a
No,
uh,
no, but you are right. You are right. It's like that he has written a book, as you said, about Germany, about Franklin Roosevelt. He has written books like that. He hasn't written a book, what I can remember now, about Russia or China or so. He was quite open during his last years, before he became a conservative, about being more respectful to the what is called the third opinion in Sweden, other Western countries, where you could also understand the Russians, the Soviet Unions, because if you were a good liberal, you would put all the critics to the Warsaw Pact and so on, and he was also like some of the left socialists in Sweden. For not he wasn't clear about it, but I knew that he had some of these thoughts, and I think he was always trying to see the problems of an opinion which was accepted by everybody. So when the lady or the man in the street and former social friend came up and said, "Isn't it good that we are so happy in Sweden when they suffer so much in the Soviet Union?" His first reaction was not yes. It was, what is the problem with the Swedish situation? He was oppositional in that sense.
um but it does occur to me to ask then, do you know or could you characterize what his thoughts on the Union were? I mean, I know he didn't write about that terribly much, but maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
I think I think it was very, very negative. I mean, it was, when I talk about this now, people may think that he was a crypto communist or something. He was so far away. He had been communist, really communist. So it's not. He in 1964, 5 something there. He was invited after when he had decided to leave the that office as a leading say chief of the library, socialist library. So that was noticed in Moscow and in East Berlin. And so he was invited to Moscow and to Berlin to meet people in the Marx Engels Institute in both countries. So he went to Moscow. He did that. He was not against that. I mean, he could have said that never I go to Moscow and meet these communists, but he did that. And that's also something of around him that just a parenthesis, he was often invited people for dinner when I was a young boy. I saw that all the time. And he always wanted to put people from different opinions and different worlds together. He could have someone who was a Jewish psychoanalyst who had been escaping from Berlin during Hitler, but he could take someone who had been a German who had been not a Nazi but had been in Hitler Jugend when he was small child, because so many were in Hitler Jugend when they were kids, and he wasn't open for that, and it worked very well. I mean, the Jewish lady understood. She knew how life was in Germany. He had lived that life, and she could understand why this man there, this doctor, was a former Hitlerjugend. She didn't bother her, and we had a lot of that sort of meeting together, people from the left to the right, and so my father didn't ask, "Are you an old Stalinist now? You are not welcome to my home." He never thought like that. So in that way, he was very, very liberal. But this is, and that is important, I think, to say. And maybe we have too little of that today. We have problems with being open and listening to people who think in other ways, and not, we should not condemn so much. But what I would just to end this story about Moscow and East Berlin, it was very fun because I was 14, 15 years old, and I had already seen him on the carpet, oriental carpet in the sleeping room. And so, but we went together, my mother and me and he, to East Berlin. He didn't want us to go to Moscow, but to East Berlin. So we were there, and we were during 3, 4 days carried around in a big limousine. You know, the party had limousines, of course, in East Berlin, and we were. They were explaining, a guide who explained how fantastic it was in the German democratic country, and we were doing all this. And my father, I looked at him. He was so kind. He was so open. He was so nice with this person. And he was so happy to have someone from Sweden and show this wonderful democratic country like they're there. But it was also a part of him that he was. So what did you think about Soviet Union? That's, I would say, it's what you say, it's hell, but it's still, you talk to them, you listen to them, you are respectful with these people who are there because they have their history, they have. So but that he would be fascinated in a positive way about their ideology, or no, never.
I mean, it's interesting because, and I want to ask sort of a question leading on from that. And let me just give you a little context why I ask that. When my father was doing military service in Sweden in the 1970s, I think that would be. He used to tell me they never talked about the Soviet Union, but when you did exercises, the enemy was always coming from the east.
Mm.
So there, in the Sweden of your father's time, there's always this awareness of a potential threat, and the Soviets did invade Finland after all. So with that in view, how did your father view America? I mean, did he see that as a sort of equally as bad as the Soviet Union, or maybe the lesser of two evils, or also bad but in a different way? I mean, I just interested in his.
Yeah, I understand. You put the same question as a Swedish journalist now, about inviting a national rightist politician. Are you for Trump or are you for Starmer? I mean, it's like that. No, but I understand your question. And I think I give the same answer. I say that he was interested in all the decline of the Western society in the United States, with the Puritanism, for example, which he hated, with a sort of religion who has lost its inner sense or the essence or something. The consumerism, the lack of deeper traditional culture, all that. And I could say in Russia you have a lot some of these qualities, but I don't think that, I mean, he could see that if someone asked, "Do you want to have these prisons like in the Soviet Union, or do you want to have the prison he went to in Ellis Island in 1949?" He would say, "Better in the States." I mean, they are more tolerant in that way, so I prefer that. But the thing is that when you talk with Western people today, you will not talk about culture. You will not talk about tradition, because there are questions they are not interested in. You will also only talk when you compare Russia to, for example, Putin to states and so. You will only talk about that. You have more freedom in the West. Yes, you have. You have more freedom in the States than you have in Russia, in a way that we can understand the word of freedom. So my father was, I think he had a problem with his reflections on the decline, what he saw decline of the Western societies, that he couldn't talk to ordinary people, not even to people writing in newspapers, articles about culture, so because they didn't see, or they didn't want to see, this problematic part of the Western world. Because if they do that, is still the case today, you are not accepted to be a part of that debate. So my father, in a way, he said to me, I asked him, because I was so frustrated about his, what I felt, very unorthodox thoughts. Say, but what can I am a young man. I want to go out in life. I can't talk about life like you do. And he said, "No, but you see, there is one way. That is to be a little group of people who have more understood what's happening with the modern society and all the problems with, and we can be a little group supporting each other, and that's the only way. You can never win. You can never win in the modern time, and someone come up and say, now we go a traditional way, or we religion will play a big role and so on. It's not possible," my father said. But I said to him, "I don't want to be in that small group. I want to go out and live the life." So I, in a way, said no to his proposals.
Well, it's sorry, I just wanted to mute myself because of
Yeah. Mm.
noise. Um, it's interesting because it leads into another question that I wanted to ask. If you, in his writing, or at least in his writing that I've seen, he never talks about activism or restoration or any kind of taking any kind of active role in politics. He doesn't, at least as I've seen, he doesn't say that one shouldn't or can't do that either, but maybe that's implicit in the fact that he doesn't address it. So maybe from what you've just said, would it be fair to say that he was opposed to activism or to active engagement in politics?
He wasn't against it, but I think that he couldn't see how it would be possible to do it without putting your feet in another corner where you don't feel that you are that you are confronting other weaknesses, so to say. Uh, I mean, activism is very complicated. We can see how activism can destroy in political different political issues. When people get activists, they can have a very good um, they have good goals for it, supporting people who are suffering or whatever. But then they can be surrounded by extremists and you are stuck to people that are not kind, so to say. And I think that he wasn't he was never an activist, also maybe as a communist, but not even that. He never went to Moscow when he was a communist, for example. There were friends, some of his friends, they did so. I mean, he was surrounded by a lot of this, we know later on, known novelists and composers and so on. They did so, but he didn't do that, and I think he was happy that he didn't, and he never walked into demonstrations or parades or anything like that. He was against that sort of, it was not his style. And it's one thing I think it's interesting. It's like when he was a social democrat, and I think he felt quite well as a social democrat from, say, 1935 up to when he started criticize or being negative to the socialism. That was the politicians who came from the working class, who wanted to make life better for people, and they had a goodwill, people of goodwill, but not of sort of extremist ideas or ideological ideas and so. And the Swedish Social Democratic Party was filled with this sort of people. They started as workers, and then they became minister of foreign affairs or something like that. So he would like them. He liked that sort of politician. He was very pragmatic in that way.
Well, thank you. And I have one last question about his political views. Um, what the views did he express about monarchy in general, in principle, but also about the Swedish monarchy in particular? So it's sort of a double question there for you.
Monarchy as a principle, he was for that. And he saw that as one of, I mean, God has given the power to the king or the emperor. And he really believed in that in a principled way. But what he saw, for example, the Swedish monarchy, it was not that he saw. But he was also saying that something who is counterbalance to that idea of giving more and more power to a people who has less and less feeling of what to use that power for. That he was thinking it's a good thing. So keep the Swedish monarchy. That was his idea. And I have a little, for ending that, a little story about when he was invited to a dinner to their king. The king and the family had dinners, so very often they still have, I think. And then there are a lot of prominent people invited. My father and with my mother were invited once for that sort of dinner. And then the king and the queen and so on, they asked some people to come and talk to them after dinner. And then he was standing in a queue to talk to one of the princesses, and just beside him was the Prime Minister Tage, who was Prime Minister from 1946 to 69 for a very long time, Social Democrat, and they knew each other, of course, very well. But Erlander was, of course, said, "Oh, Tage Lindbom, what has he done?" and so on. But they were meeting. Tage had a lot of humor. He was known for having. So my father was standing. Yeah, but that was the Prime Minister just beside me. So he joked with Tage and said, "Well, hey, here we stand, two ancient republicans in front of the royal court." And that was because they were both Republicans. My father was also a Republican, of course, when he was a socialist. And then the Prime Minister Tage laughed. He saw the humor about that situation.
So yeah, well, thank you for that. It was very amusing. Um, so just by way of conclusion,
Yeah.
um, not unfortunately, not much of his work has been translated into English. Until pretty recently, it was just two books, and now I think there are four. Four have been translated.
Maybe, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I
Um,
translated too. I've been in my editing house. Yes, yes.
yeah, yes. So it was there's the Myth of Democracy. I forget there was another one that was translated, but more recently you translated the his commentary on the Quran,
Yes, Encounters in Quran. Yes.
and then also the Taras in the Good Grain.
No, that was,
Sorry, that was earlier.
but the last one is the windmills of Sancho Panza.
Yes, that's right.
Translation of the book of the most, I would say, the most important book he has written. There was a book coming out in 1962. I told earlier about that book where he was not the Sufi, but he had met God in Chartres, and then he wrote that book, and then he met Kurt Almqvist, and so this Windmills of Sancho Panza, I think is you can get them on Amazon. They are there, so like Encountering the Quran too. So it's very easy to, if you are interested, to pick them up and buy them.
And what I'll do is I'll include links for
Mm.
the Amazon in the description. Um, but would it be, so you think that's his most important work? Is it also the work that people should start with if they haven't read anything of his work, or?
Depends, of course, of who you are. I mean, if you are a Muslim or a Sufi, maybe you, I guess, at Encountering the Quran. If you are more spiritual, maybe also that is a book that is interesting to start with. But if you are interested, we have talked a lot about his political journey, or you can call it, during his life. And then I think the Windmills of Sancho Panza, it's so interesting because it's edited in 62, but it's written in 58, 59, a period when people dreamed of this, shall we so to say, modernist society. Everything would be fantastic. We see some of the results today. But I mean, this is interesting, and see how much he was a prophet in some ways, and he has a criticism about liberalism and socialism. I think are very very good, and so I think this is a book to start with, and as not so many are Myth of Democracy is, I know that they will also come in Turkish, and so I mean it's obviously it's interesting in some countries close to Mediterranean also. Maybe that's a book to read, but it's more difficult to find it. But these two I mentioned, you can buy them easily.
So the final question is what's the what are the next of his works to be translated?
I don't know. We are discussing with the person. I'm discussing that, so we'll see in the future. But I'm sure that there will be more books. We have to see that. I've also written a biography about my father, but it's in Swedish, and so that during these last 3, 4 years, there's been at least 3 books, and some of the old books in Swedish have been re-edited, but in Swedish. But the and so I mean we have done a lot of work, but we don't stop there. So but I can't give you a schedule for the next book.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time and very engaging interview. And is there any sort of final words or anything you'd like to?
No, you have put so many good questions, and I've talked so maybe too long about them. I hope there's still one or two who is listening now at the end. But it was been interesting to try to explain what it was an interesting life of Tage Lindbom. So I'm also a little bit fascinated by him, I must admit.
All right, well, thank you very much, and I'll end the recording here. If you value my work, I'd be most grateful if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, and share this video with anyone you think might be interested. If you would like to support me in working on this project, I'd be deeply thankful if you would consider becoming a regular supporter through Patreon or making a one-time donation through Ko-fi, links in the description. If you do subscribe, please remember to hit that little bell icon, because otherwise YouTube won't inform you when I upload new videos. If you'd prefer to read my essays over the video format, they are all available in written form on Substack. Link also in the description.